There is a door 40 feet below Gene Hackman's private library. No handle on the outside. No visible hinges. Weld marks running along every seam, methodical and deliberate, like someone wanted to make absolutely certain it would never open from the other side. No one who has seen it will explain what it means. That detail will matter. Remember it. On the morning of February 26, 2025, a handyman arrived at 1425 Old Sunset Trail in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was around 11 o'clock. The air was dry and cold the way Santa Fe mornings tend to be in late winter, and the property looked like it always did from the outside. Quiet, private, enormous. $4 million worth of adobe, stone, and desert seclusion set back behind gates that most people in the neighborhood had never seen open. He knocked. Nobody came. He tried again. Still nothing. And something about the quality of that silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, made him call the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department. He told deputies that he believed the couple inside had died. That is a specific kind of certainty. Not that they weren't home, not that something seemed off, that they had died inside. Law enforcement arrived and forced entry. The gates were reinforced and sealed. Getting through them was not a formality. Gene Hackman was 985 years old. That number alone deserves a moment. 985 years. A man who had lived long enough to watch the entire arc of Hollywood transform from black and white studio pictures to digital streaming, who had worked alongside screen legends, who had stood on award stages and spoken from a place of genuine artistic authority. 5 Academy Award nominations. 2 Oscar wins. The French Connection. He played Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle with a kind of raw, relentless energy that didn't feel like acting. It felt like surveillance footage of a man coming apart under his own momentum. The Oscar followed. Unforgiven gave him a second. Cold, institutional, cruel in the way bureaucracies are cruel, not with passion, but with procedure. The Conversation. Hoosiers. Enemy of the State. Each film a different register, a different kind of intelligence at work. He could play menace and tenderness in the same scene, and you believed both. Then, in 2004, Gene Hackman retired. No farewell tour, no streaming documentary. He simply stopped. He moved to Santa Fe and for 2 decades lived a life the public largely could not see. He wrote novels. He read. He kept to himself. The people who knew him described a man who was warm, literary, private, and entirely at peace with his invisibility. A man who walked away from fame while still at its peak and never once appeared to regret it. That was the public version. Peaceful, simple, quiet. His wife, Betsy Hackman, was 65 years old. When deputies finally made it through those reinforced gates on February 26, they found her inside the mansion. She had been dead for approximately 1 week. Not a day, not 2 days. 1 week. And according to the official framing, Gene Hackman had been alive inside that house with her body for the entire duration. He had not called anyone. He had not raised an alarm. He had not opened the gates. He died sometime after she did, and sometime before the handyman arrived that morning. The official determination: natural causes. No signs of foul play. In isolation, that framing might have been enough to close the story. An elderly man. A grieving widower. A private death in a private place. Sad, but not strange. Except the house told a different story. From the outside, the estate was beautiful in the way that serious wealth tends to be, understated, intentional, almost museum-like, stone and adobe, high walls, mature desert landscaping. It felt curated, built not for spectacle, but for permanence. Inside, something had shifted. Furniture had been dragged, not rearranged, dragged. Books had been pulled from shelves not randomly, but selectively, as though someone was looking for something specific. Drawers were open throughout the property. The bedroom safe was open and empty. The internal camera system, The closed-circuit surveillance network Hackman had maintained across the estate had been disabled. Law enforcement described the scene as unusual. That is a carefully chosen word. Not disturbed, not violent. Unusual. Because nothing pointed clearly toward crime, and yet nothing pointed clearly toward two elderly people dying peacefully in a home they loved. The safe being empty could mean anything. The cameras being disabled could mean anything. Together, they formed a texture investigators could not absorb into the natural causes narrative and simply move on. They called in additional resources. The thermal scan returned a reading that required a second look. A heat signature beneath the foundation, significant enough to flag, consistent enough to rule out ambient geological variation. Something beneath the ground was generating or retaining warmth. The structural scan followed. Ground-penetrating radar. What it returned was not ambiguous. There was a void beneath the property. Massive, the investigator said. A void that should not exist beneath a private residence. This is where the story changes. Because up until this moment, the deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were being handled as a private tragedy. The moment the structural scan returned that reading, the case became something else entirely. The hidden mechanism was located in Gene Hackman's private library, not a bookcase on a simple pivot, a specific activation sequence built into the wall itself, requiring knowledge of the correct operation to engage. The kind of concealment engineered to look like nothing, to appear as ordinary wall and shelf and architecture until you know exactly what you are looking for. Agents activated the mechanism. A section of wall opened. Stone steps descended into the dark. The air that came up from below was immediate and specific. Cold. Not the passive cold of an unheated basement, something more deliberate. Temperature-managed cold, damp at the edges, carrying the metallic undertone of old concrete and the faint staleness of sealed circulation. The walls of the descent showed markings, inscriptions, schematics, annotations that would take time to catalog. The structure around the staircase was reinforced concrete and steel, wide enough for a small vehicle to navigate, running through the ceiling, state-of-the-art ventilation ducting, and LED lighting on a separate power circuit. Someone had not dug a tunnel. Someone had engineered one. At approximately 100 feet below the surface, the passage opened into a chamber the size of a basketball court. Climate-controlled shelving lined every wall, and the shelves held books. Not decorative collections purchased by the yard, rare, significant, the kinds of objects institutions spend decades trying to acquire. Shakespeare folios, medieval illuminated manuscripts, first editions from Hemingway and Fitzgerald, in conditions that collectors describe in voices that drop to near whispers. The estimated value of what occupied those shelves, over $100 million. Pause on that number, $100 million. In a chamber beneath a private residence in Santa Fe. Beneath a man who told the world he spent his retirement reading quietly. He was not wrong. The reading was real. The books were real. They were simply not where anyone expected them to be. And the scale of what he had assembled was not the scale of a private enthusiast. It was the scale of a curator, or someone who believed these objects needed to be protected from something he never publicly named. At approximately 200 feet, the passage opened again into a film preservation laboratory. Humidity-controlled vaults, temperature-controlled vaults, the kind of environmental systems used by National Archives. Thousands of film reels, cataloged and housed, rare prints from the golden age of Hollywood, films that exist in no other known copy, prints in conditions specialists would spend careers trying to achieve. And then the other material. Unreleased scenes. Alternate endings. International films from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Titles that had been suppressed, lost, or never distributed into the Western archive. Film scholars had listed as missing. Films presumed gone. Gene Hackman had them. How he acquired them, what arrangements he made, what he intended, none of those questions were answered by the discovery itself. He had spent years building something down here, not for profit, not for display, for keeps. If you have followed this evidence this far, the thermal scan, the void, the mechanism, the descent, the library, the film laboratory, 2 chambers of irreplaceable material 100 and 200 feet beneath the desert floor, then ask yourself one question and stay with it. What requires a third level? At approximately 300 feet, the passage ended at a door. Iron. Heavy. The rivets were spaced with the precision associated with mid-20th century high-security installations, not modern engineering. Something older, built in an era when security meant mass and material rather than electronics and code. The rust on the surface was real rust, earned over decades. The scale of the door was not domestic, it was institutional. No exterior handle, no visible hinges. Weld marks ran along every seam, continuous and deliberate, not done for insulation or structural reinforcement. Done to prevent the door from being opened from the outside, sealed from the inside. The tunnel beyond it was silent. 50 federal agents standing at that threshold, deep into a search operation that had required years of legal proceedings and a federal warrant to authorize, reported nothing from the other side. No sound, no temperature differential, no reading that indicated what lay beyond the iron, the welds, the absent handle. The FBI said nothing publicly about what lies on the other side. And 40 feet below the library where Gene Hackman kept his books, behind a door with no handle on the outside and no explanation anyone was willing to give, the question that no one could answer was just beginning. The door does not move. Every account agrees on that. 50 federal agents, a federal warrant, the full weight of an active FBI search operation, and the door simply stands there. Iron, rust, rivets, silence. The structural engineers on site ran their hands along the frame and came back with an assessment that landed like a stone dropped into still water. This was not a lock designed to keep people out. It was a lock designed to keep something in. That distinction matters more than it seems. A lock that keeps people out faces outward. The mechanism, the handle, the authority of the barrier, all oriented toward the approaching visitor. What stood at 300 feet faced inward. Everything about its construction assumed the threat to be managed was not outside the door. Whatever built this door wanted to make sure what was on the other side stayed there. Marcus Devlin had spent decades reading structures the way other people read text. When he was brought in to assess the tunnel system beneath 1425 Old Sunset Trail, he descended with instruments and took his time. His conclusions were not what investigators had been expecting. The deepest sections of the tunnel were not built by Gene Hackman. The upper portions, the entrance mechanism, the reinforced concrete, the lead systems and ventilation showed signatures of renovation, modernization, deliberate improvement of something that already existed. But the core structure, the foundational engineering that gave the tunnel its shape and depth and direction, was older, significantly older. Old enough that Hackman could not have commissioned it. This wasn't built by the homeowner, Devlin said. The upper section was renovated, modernized, reinforced, but the core of this tunnel was already here. Hackman did not build this. He moved into it. He inherited it. That reframes everything. The tunnel was not a project Gene Hackman undertook in retirement. It was something he found, something already there when he arrived, or discovered to be there, and then deliberately, systematically, over years, chosen to occupy, to curate, and to protect. Which means the question is not just what Gene Hackman was hiding. It is what Gene Hackman found. When the iron door was finally breached, the method not publicly disclosed, what lay on the other side was not empty space. The chamber was older than the tunnel that led to it. The air inside carried the density of a sealed space that had not been circulated in a very long time. Not the managed cold of the upper chambers, the fixed, settled stillness of genuine enclosure. Air that has not moved since the door was last closed from the inside. Ancient wooden crates lined the walls, not antique in the decorative sense, aged in the way of objects built for containment, built to survive. Yellow documents, rusted metallic objects of unclear function, old photographs, not digital prints, but photographic prints of genuine age, edges browned, surfaces carrying the silver-tone quality of early 20th century photography. And insignias, organizational insignias stamped onto document headers, embossed onto folder corners, that investigators ran through every available database and received the same answer each time: dissolved. The organizations no longer existed. In several cases, there was no clear record of their ever having existed at all. The photographs were examined carefully. Unknown faces, men and women in early 20th century clothing. Clandestine in their composition, not posed portraits, but images taken at moments the subjects may not have known were being recorded. Underground spaces that bore no match to any known structure in any available record. Men gathered around maps, faces partially obscured, postures suggesting the gravity of something being planned or decided. One photograph was different from the others. On its face, a gathering. Men in clothing consistent with the late 1930s, assembled in a subterranean space that looked engineered and deliberate. On its back, a handwritten date, 1937, and one word, a single word, in an unidentified language, written in ink the color of dried rust. The word could not be immediately translated. The language itself was not immediately matched to any known system. 1937, within living memory. Whatever that photograph documented, it happened in a world that still connects to this one. The floor of the chamber stopped agents in their tracks. Circular patterns covered the stone surface, carved with a level of precision inconsistent with informal marking. Taken as a whole, they form celestial mapping, star charts of mathematical accuracy, constellations plotted to specific astronomical alignments, planetary positions, orbital paths rendered in stone with a degree of precision that, analysts noted, required advanced knowledge of astronomical mechanics. Someone who stood in that chamber and looked down was not looking at art. They were looking at a calendar, or a clock, or a key of a kind most people today would not know how to read. Inside the crates, investigators also recovered tools. Objects whose physical construction suggested significant age but whose internal engineering did not match what that age should have produced. Unknown engravings along the handles and casings, not alphabetic in any recognized script, but systematic in spacing and repetition. Internal mechanisms too precise for the manufacturing capabilities of the era they appeared to come from. And one object drew sustained attention: a metal cylinder, palm-sized. No visible seams, not the seamlessness of machining, but the kind suggesting the object was not assembled conventionally. Internal rings that rotated smoothly, without friction, without the mechanical resistance of age. No manufacturer's mark, no matching entry in any catalog the recovery team had access to. What it was for, what it measured or operated or communicated, nobody said. The documents were not straightforward. They were not meant to be. Coded dates embedded in what otherwise appeared to be correspondence. Redacted names, not blacked out with modern tools but physically removed, cut from the page with precision. Watermarks linking the documents to organizations that, like the insignias, return no current match. Partially burned pages, not destroyed, but burned to a point and then preserved. As if someone had started a fire and changed their mind, or as if the burning itself was the message, and the surviving text was what was meant to be kept. One document described a network with no name still on record. Operational language, structural language, the vocabulary of something organized and persistent. At the bottom of its last surviving page, a symbol matching one of the insignias found on the crates. Whatever this network was, it left its mark on everything in that chamber. The suppression of information around the Hackman estate did not begin with his death. It had been running for years before it. Workers hired for construction and maintenance at 1425 Old Sunset Trail signed non-disclosure agreements. Staff were handpicked, vetted beyond standard background checks, legally bound in terms more comprehensive than any ordinary residential INDA would require. Building permits on file were remarkable for what they did not contain. Mundane surface descriptions matching none of the scale of what was discovered. Redactions. Incomplete filings. Dates that did not sequence correctly against the construction timeline neighbors had partially observed. Property records showed gaps, not the result of accident or neglect, the result of attention paid to ensuring certain information did not persist in accessible form. A researcher affiliated with the Santa Fe Historical Society had begun investigating the land records connected to the property. Others in that community noted the investigation, and then it stopped. The researcher stopped returning calls. The work was never published. No explanation was given. Local journalists who approached the story after February 2025 found walls. Not ordinary bureaucratic friction, a consistency of silence across multiple agencies and departments that felt less like caution and more like coordinated narrative management. The official story held, and around it, every avenue that might complicate it appeared to close. Dr. James Whitfield spent 19 years as a forensic analyst processing classified evidence for the FBI. When he reviewed what was publicly known about the Hackman case, he did not hesitate. When an agency goes this quiet, this fast, it means one of two things, he said. Either they found nothing and they're embarrassed, or they found something so significant that the disclosure conversation has moved above the investigative team. He paused. This doesn't look like embarrassment. That assessment carries weight precisely because of its source. Whitfield is not a theorist. He is a proceduralist, a man who spent 2 decades inside the architecture of how federal agencies handle discovery and disclosure. His read of institutional silence is pattern recognition. And the pattern he identifies in the FBI's public posture on the Hackman Tunnel is not the pattern of an agency that found an eccentric collector's underground library and filed it accordingly. Richard Payne spent the latter part of his career as a consultant to the Department of Energy, specifically in areas touching on infrastructure legacy, the physical remnants of Cold War-era construction that had been built, classified, partially decommissioned, and in many cases, never fully accounted for. He knew northern New Mexico in a particular way, not as desert landscape or cultural heritage, as a map of where the American government had buried its most significant scientific and strategic work in the mid-20th century. Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project. Infrastructure that did not simply vanish when its immediate purpose was completed, that was decommissioned in some places, repurposed in others, and in others still simply sealed and left and officially forgotten. Northern New Mexico was not incidentally the geography of that history. It was specifically, deliberately chosen for it. Payne's assessment of the tunnel beneath 1425 Old Sunset Trail, consistent with a pattern of underground infrastructure in the region that predated Hackman's arrival by decades and had never been fully mapped or disclosed. The tunnel might not be Hackman's secret alone. It might be a piece of a larger buried architecture he encountered, or was directed toward, or came to occupy by design. That thread does not close. It opens. At some point in the investigation, a federal analyst compiled available evidence, property records, thermal scan data, body camera transcripts from the tunnel entry, tunnel photographs, images of the coded documents and chamber artifacts, and fed it into an internal analysis system. The system's classification of the property returned 3 readings: residential, low confidence; private archival facility, moderate confidence; restricted access preservation or suppression complex, high confidence. Central pattern identified, a concealed structure designed to outlast its owner, not to serve the owner, not to protect the owner, to persist beyond the life of the person who maintained it, to continue existing after the death of the person who appeared to be responsible for it. Secondary pattern, human reputation maintained above ground, while contrary evidence accumulated below ground. Gene Hackman, the warm literary recluse. Gene Hackman, the private man who walked away from fame. All of that above the surface. And below, chambers, coded documents, dissolved organizations, an iron door sealed from the inside, artifacts nobody has explained. When the analyst asked the system whether concealment of this kind could be permanent, the response was direct. No known closed system remains sealed indefinitely under death, decay, legal intervention, or environmental change. Not a judgment, simply the mechanical observation that nothing stays sealed forever. That every buried thing eventually surfaces, and that the only question concealment ever truly answers is not whether something will be found, but when. Now return to the door. Everything discovered in that chamber, the crates and photographs, the 1937 date and the unknown word, the celestial maps carved into the stone floor, the cylinder with rotating rings and no visible seams, the coded documents and dissolved organization insignias, the partially burned pages, the Cold War infrastructure thread running beneath northern New Mexico, the AI system's identification of a concealed structure designed to outlast its owner, all of it assembles now around a single point, the iron door. No exterior handle, no visible hinges, weld marks along every seam, sealed from the inside. From the beginning, that door was presented as the mystery, the thing that could not be explained. But the door was never the mystery. The door was the answer to a question nobody above ground had thought to ask yet. A door sealed from the inside does not trap people outside. It protects what is within from the world beyond it. The person who last closed that door, who applied those welds from the sealed side, decided that what lay inside mattered enough that no one who did not already know should ever be able to simply walk in. The door was not a lock. It was a declaration. Gene Hackman was 95 years old when he died. He had been inside that house, alone with the body of his wife, for approximately 7 days. 7 days in which no call was made, no alarm raised, no gate opened. What keeps a man silent for 7 days in a house with a dead loved one? Not grief alone. Grief reaches outward. Grief calls someone. 7 days of chosen silence in a house with a tunnel beneath it and an iron door at its deepest point is not a symptom of loss. It is the behavior of a man who has something that requires management, even at the end of everything. A man sitting at the surface of a life built in 2 layers, at the moment when both layers are finally coming undone. Was Gene Hackman the last guardian of something buried long before he was born? Or was he its final prisoner? That question has no public answer. The FBI has not provided one. The chamber beyond the iron door has not been described in any official disclosure. The coded documents, the celestial maps, the cylinder with no seams, the photograph from 1937 with the word in the unknown language, none of it has been formally addressed by any agency with the authority to say, this is what it means. Which means the door, in a very real sense, is still sealed. If this story sits with you the way it should, not as spectacle, but as something that refuses to leave, stay with it. The conversation about what was found beneath that estate and what it connects to and what it was meant to protect is one the official record has not decided to have. Sometimes the only way those conversations get forced open is by enough people refusing to let them stay quiet. There is a door 40 feet below Gene Hackman's private library. You knew that at the beginning of this story. You set it aside because the full weight of it had not yet arrived. It has arrived now. No exterior handle, no visible hinges, weld marks along every seam, applied from the inside by someone who closed that door for the last time and made certain it would not open easily. Not for investigators, not for agents with federal warrants, not for the world that would eventually come looking. At the beginning, the door was a strange detail, an unexplained thing at the bottom of a very deep passage. Now you know what it means. It means that somewhere in the life of a man, the world believed it understood completely. There was a room. And in that room, there were things someone decided the world was not ready to see, and that someone, whether it was Hackman himself, or someone before him, or something larger and older than any single human life, sealed the room from the inside, not to keep people out, to make sure that when the door finally opened, what came through it could not be put back.